everyone, welcome back. This month we are going to talk all about APIs. Always be controlling your APIs with authorization. So grab your favorite beverage, sit back, relax, and take a listen. Hey, everybody, and welcome back. Spring has sprung, which means people start to talk about spring cleaning, and there is nothing more important in terms of your spring cleaning efforts than looking at how you can clean up access to APIs. See what I did there, folks? So, hello, I'm Kelly O'Dwyer Manuel, Vice President of Marketing and Communications for Axiomatics. I have with me, as always, my incredibly insightful co-host, David Brossard. Hey, David, how you doing?
Doing good. Good morning, everyone.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good night. So David, we last month we promised we would come back this month with a rollicking good chat around APIs, and I know that there were a couple of big conferences this month. One we'll start with you were at the Nordic API Summit, which, as the title would suggest, is a lot about APIs. So do you want to maybe start by sharing a little bit about what jumped out at you from that conference? Was there anything new in terms of the API access control and authorization discussion that was burning a hole in your mind post conference?
Well, I'll start by saying that I thought I was going to South by Southwest, and I ended up going to Nordic APIs. I got tricked. I wasn't paying attention to the details. All I saw was a flight ticket to Austin in March. I was like, "Ooh, South by Southwest." Joke aside, a lot of new things are happening with APIs. I think it's the same trend we see everywhere, right? It's modernization. It's making things smaller, so the microservices trend, making things lighter,
Mhm.
making things everything as code first. And in particular, there is a whole new slew of API gateway vendors out there that are making protecting APIs way cooler, way easier. I'm thinking of Zuplo, for instance, which is very much a code first API gateway that you can program extremely easily and then expose your APIs with, with all the threat protection that you'd want to have on your APIs. I think that's one of the bigger changes that I've seen, not just this past month, of course, but it's been over the past year or couple of years that there's these new incumbents making API gateways cooler, faster, easier to use, SaaS based. Yeah, just that many more incentives for API developers to not skimp on security and do the right thing.
Well, that's good to know. I mean, I think who among us doesn't want a way to do things more easily in their job to be able to do it better? So that really makes sense. I think, David, in the discussions that you and I have had in the last year around APIs, it's really evolved because I know that months ago when we were chatting, I think there was maybe not as much an understanding about why API security is such a broad bucket and that you needed to be able to drill down a little bit more. And since that point in time, I know you've published a blog on the limitations of OAuth, for example, and why that might drive some different thinking around this area. And based on what you're saying, which again makes total sense, where do you see this discussion going in the next year? Do you think things are going to change significantly, or are we still kind of going to continue to take those the baby steps that we currently see around APIs and externalized authorization?
I think probably a bit of both.
Okay.
On the one hand, there is renewed attention to all of the threats and attack vectors that exist on APIs. If you look at the OWASP project, they have a famous list of OWASP top 10 that is published every 4 years. So the latest one was 2021. But they also have a dedicated one on API security specifically. And the fact that they have a dedicated one on API security shows how important it is to secure your APIs. It shows how easy of a target an API is because you're building an API, you're happy to have an API within your company, you put it out there, and you don't think about basic security things such as authentication, such as authorization. And if you look at the list of security risks that OWASP has, it goes into more detail. Things like broken access control, or something sometimes referred to as broken object level authorization, or BOLA. It's a mouthful.
Hmm.
But also, if you look at the one that they have on number 5 in their list, broken function level authorization, where through an API you can actually expose functionality that you're not supposed to expose the way you're exposing it, and you don't have the controls and the checks. I think the existing techniques to secure APIs, such as just plain old authentication, maybe through API keys, and of course OAuth, they're an excellent starting points. And I don't think anything's going to replace that in the short term. That being said, don't try to use a hammer for every single problem. And when you get into the API challenges that OWASP points out, so the broken object level authorization or the unrestricted access to sensitive business flows, this is where OAuth is going to need a helping hand, and this is where we come in, the fine grained authorization folks, to provide with that additional layer of authorization, that additional layer of protection, working hand in hand with OAuth. We're not replacing OAuth, we're extending what it can do to provide more relevant authorization.
Okay, that makes sense. And I know the other thing that we've talked about too when it comes to authorization is there not everything is created equal. There are some specific things that using policy-driven authorization, fine-grained access control, whatever you want to call it, though I know there are differences there, that there are some differences in terms of what you want to do, and how that flow kind of works. So do you want, if you had a developer audience, I'm sure, let's pretend there are 400 developers listening to this episode right now, and kudos to all of you, that would be wonderful. What is it you would want to tell them if to consider in an authorization solution? What should they be looking for specifically?
So it's a matter of defining your authorization use cases in plain old English, first and foremost.
Okay.
If you have an API, and actually, sorry, let's take a step back. It's a matter of defining your business use cases first and foremost. If you have an API that exposes business data, let's just say you are in the medical world and you're building the next generation of EHR, so electronic health records, and you want to share those records with the patients, of course, with the medical staff, with the non-medical staff supporting the medical staff, with potentially third-party entities like the insurance company, the drug companies, the pharmacies, right? These are your business use cases. But also, you have to define what an EHR is. What does it contain? Is it just medical data? Is it personal data? Is it financial information, billing data? Like, what is the record? Or is it a conjunction of multiple records that you tie together to get to get a good picture of what the patient or who the patient is? Okay, so do that first. And the good thing, what I really like with APIs is that it's something that you do quite naturally as you want to expose functionality through APIs so that you can integrate with multiple entities or parties or services. You have
Mhm.
to go through that exercise of thinking about the data model, thinking about the information model more broadly, thinking about what it is you want to have happen, the functions you want to expose. And that, from an authorization standpoint, is great because the next step is define the authorization use cases. And if you have defined the information model correctly, if you have defined the flows correctly, the use case correctly, well, defining the authorization is going to be relatively straightforward. And it could be things like, oh, I know I need to comply with HIPAA or HL7 medical compliance. Or it could be, I know that I want to implement a delegation scenario whereby a parent can see a child's medical record, or a parent can see a senior citizen's medical record, whereby I want to store consent, ask for and store consent, a patient's consent about sharing medical data with an insurance company. These are all the authorization use cases that you can think of. And these authorization use cases, oftentimes we think about authorization, authentication, and security as a whole as a boring thing that you have to do because you got to be safe. But actually, they're also enablers.
Mhm.
So going back to the last example I gave, the one about storing consent, asking for consent, storing consent, and then sharing the data with the insurance company. Maybe that gives an opportunity for the hospital to offer the patient a discounted rates on their treatment because they're sharing data with the insurance company or with allowance, so on and so forth. So you're creating new opportunities. Now, not all to go back to your question, Kelly, not all authorization is created equal. When you look at mechanisms that exist within OAuth, you essentially have tokens, you have scopes, and you have claims. So very easily with OAuth, you can do things like, oh, I want to give the hospital access to my records in this EHR store, but it doesn't really tell you which specific set of records. So it's your entire set of records. And maybe you don't want to share everything. The example I gave at Nordic APIs, the conference was as I was prepping my presentation, I wanted to share my slide deck with a storage service online like Dropbox or whatever. And it was doing it through file share. And the file share service online wanted access to all my Google Drive for the one slide deck. That's kind of overreaching. And that's the challenge with OAuth is it's pretty coarse grained, right? It's either you give access to a function, access to the files, or read access to the files in this case, or you don't. And that's where finer grained authorization kicks in because you're going to be able to express things like relationships or access control lists or conditional access. So you could say, oh, I want to share files with this service if and only if they were created on this day and I've tagged the file good for publishing and so on and so forth. So you could have more fine grained use cases. And that's what um, the new solutions out there in terms of authorization, be it Axiomatics with policy-driven authorization, be it other products based on, say, Zanzibar, Google's model, or graph-based authorization, we're all out there to solve the next mile in terms of authorization that OAuth can't solve for you today.
That makes total sense. And I'm glad you brought up some of the other models as well, because that brings me to kind of our next topic. So the week before you were in Austin, I was in London at the Gartner Identity and Access Management Summit. And I was able to attend a session on runtime authorization from by Espen Bago, who
Mhm.
founder of ID Pro, legend in the industry, obviously, and he had a lot to say about these languages and what they mean for the next evolution of authorization. And to his point, and it was great because I'd seen this was the second year in a row Gartner had kind of that I had attended that they'd had a deep dive on authorization and what externalized authorization solutions look like, the languages and all of that. But Aspen went a bit further and looked at, okay, depending upon your use case, there's several things that are purpose fit. So for API access, I know when you get into those types of things, David, do you have an opinion as to what it is, the best purpose fit when you're talking about things like Zanzibar and other stuff? Do you have a preference?
Of course, I'm biased. So I would say policy, and it's not just for APIs, right? I think overall policy-driven authorization based on, say, Rego or Alpha or XACML makes a lot more sense, right? And the reason I say this is policies are easier to look at and understand and edit and audit and do access reviews on than any other kind of configuration. One of the challenges with OAuth is that if you do create claims and scopes, and let's assume that you create configuration that is fine grained enough to achieve the scenario that you want to achieve, you end up in kind of the same mess that we had with RBAC and the need to do provisioning, deprovisioning, and the need to do
Right.
access reviews and governance and recertification of that configuration. Whereas with policy, you avoid that. And with policy, you can run the recertification of the policy. You can run the access review on the policy. It makes it simpler. The gap between what it is you want to achieve in plain old English and what it is you do implement with the technical artifacts is way smaller in a policy-driven world. Now, I will add that there's essentially three models today that you can use for authorization. Putting
Hmm.
OAuth aside for a minute, the three models are going to be policy-driven authorization. So, of course, you have XACML, Alpha, you have Rego from Open Policy Agent, you have AWS Cedar, you have proprietary formats from the likes of Cerbos and OSO and Signal as well. Then you also have graph-based authorization, like from the likes of Three Edges, from the likes of I think OpenFGA, or I'm sorry, Signal also use a graph. And you also have access control lists based on the Zanzibar approach, which is what OpenFGA is doing, right? So you can choose any one of those models. I'll say that graph-based authorization probably makes sense if you're in a graph world. So if you have, graph-based APIs, Neo4j, GraphQL, maybe graph-based authorization makes sense. But apart from that, my favorite, to go back to the original question, is policy. And the reason it's my favorite, apart from the fact that I'm biased, is that when you build up an API and when you go about documenting the API through a Swagger, through an open API file, or through other documentation techniques. At the conference, I met a great individual from Microsoft who was focusing on documentation standards, and he and I had a bit of a chat about authorization. And clearly, if you have a policy, you can attach the policy to the documentation, and now you have a clear trace of what it is you're enforcing on your APIs. It makes a whole lot more sense than just configuration as you would with ACLs or graphs.
So David, maybe let's talk about, where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. So what if you're going to deploy this, what does this look like? What are all of what's the process here? What does it look like? What needs to be involved? What are the critical things you need to think on? Can you walk us through that a little bit?
That's a fantastic question, and I'm glad you brought it up. So there's really a question of where you want to enforce when you have an API. That's the first question you want to ask. And you might want to enforce within the API framework itself. Let's assume that you've built your API using Java Spring framework. Java Spring has annotations that you can use that can act as your policy enforcement point. That could be a place where you could do enforcement. It's not my favorite though, because it is decoupled from the application code, but it is still related to or somewhat coupled to the framework that you're using to develop the API. The other place where you could do API enforcement, of course, would be in an API gateway, in a web application firewall, something sitting in front of and disconnected from your API. So I'm thinking of, the usual suspects like MuleSoft and Apigee and Axway and Broadcom Layer 7, and also, the new kids on the block, the cool new gateways like Zuplo or Kong or Istio, depending on what it is you want to sit. So this, in my mind, is like one of the better places for enforcement. But what's also interesting is that traditionally, when we think about applying authorization to APIs, we think about what I call inbound authorization. For instance, if I have, going back to the medical record, if I have /records/123, I'm doing an inbound request. So I'm saying, hey, I'm David. Here's my JOT token saying that I'm David, and I want to get access to /records/123. The API gateway would then fire off an authorization request to Axiomatics and say, or the PDP, and say, hey, could David view record 123? And the answer is going to be yes or no, permit deny. Great. That's inbound authorization. But what you could also do, and that's really neat, is authorization on the way back. As the response flows through that gateway, you could have the gateway ask, oh, can David view part one, part two, part three, the financial data, the medical data, the personal info data of this medical record? And that enables things like data redaction, data masking, potentially filtering on the data that you're retrieving from the backend API. And that creates a whole other set of authorization use cases that I think are quite cool. And that is where the true power of fine-grained authorization lies for APIs with a policy-driven approach.
And I love that. I think that's great because it is as we see this, the whole idea of authorization for APIs, as we see that maturing and progressing, that overall discussion, I guess, that's the kind of detail that people are going to look for, right? That's the thirst is okay. I'm on board. I get that this is a thing I want to do. What does the actual doing look like?
Yep.
So, I know you and I have talked about maybe having some live stream sessions where we walk through some of that kind of thing. So I think, folks, if you're listening and that would be something you're interested in, feel free to hit us up in the comments or reach out to David or I and say I'm in or pose a question because I think we'd love to get that up off the ground. It sounds like there's definitely some thirst out there for that. I think, David, the other question I would have is just, is there anything else about APIs that we maybe haven't covered this episode? If we're going to say it's all about APIs, I want to make sure we've covered everything. Is there anything else that's been top of mind for you that you want to get out there to folks?
Well, I think generally speaking, APIs are not going anywhere. There's gonna be a whole lot more APIs, and there are a whole lot more APIs every minute, every day. Bill Dorfeld had a really interesting statistic in his presentation at Nordic APIs on how many million APIs exist. I actually think the number he quoted, which was from 2021, 2022, is massively understated because it only looks at public APIs, and of course there's that many more internal APIs. So that creates an opportunity for API gateways for authorizing products like Axiomatics, of course, but it also creates the risk for companies of API sprawl. And you want to make sure, and API spaghetti, if you will, you want to make sure that you keep good track of your API. So you're going to need a good API management solution. And it also creates the need for that externalized decoupled authorization because you want to store your authorization in one place so that you know what level authorization you're applying on your APIs and that you're applying it consistently, more importantly.
Awesome. Well, now as we wrap this episode, I need to go get some spaghetti because that's all I can think about now. So thank you. That's a great visual that's made me hungry. Um, Thank you, David. As always, lots of great insight here about APIs. I hope you all have enjoyed it. Next month, we are going to turn our heads to Identiverse and EIC. We've got a couple of other big momentous events on the horizon here, so we're going to talk through what we expect out of that. And yeah, as always, thanks, David. Appreciate the conversation. It's always good stuff catching up with you.
Yeah, my pleasure. And if folks are interested in the slide deck that I used at the conference, they can go to bit.ly/API authz, API all lowercase.
Fantastic. I've seen the presentation. It's a good one. Definitely worth checking out. Well, thanks again for listening, folks. If you have ideas for future topics you'd like to see us cover, please share a comment, shoot us a note. Any of those things, we'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, thanks again, David. Take care, everyone, and we will chat again next month.
My pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Dynamically Speaking. Stay tuned for our next one, and in the meantime, check the show notes and connect with us on LinkedIn and YouTube. And visit us at axiomatics.com to learn more about our authorization solution.